Welcome to Adult Bible Study with Bill. The scripture for our lesson comes from Acts chapter 22, verses 30 through chapter 23, verse 11. Reverend Bob Gardner, the author of the summer 2026 edition of Adult Bible Study, introduces this lesson by saying, Paul is once again caught up in the confusion and misunderstanding of the Jews regarding his ministry to the Gentiles. How would Paul face this new crisis from the Jewish leaders? Would he remain consistent in his faith to share the gospel with all people? While the Apostle Paul returned to Jerusalem, he was given a warm and cordial greeting from many of the brothers and sisters in the faith. However, background scripture from Acts chapter 21 tells us that on the next day, James had to advise Paul that while thousands of Jews had accepted Christ, there were still those who practiced circumcision and who were strict keepers of the law. Furthermore, it had been reported to these Jews that Paul taught all Jews who lived among the Gentiles must reject Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children nor to live according to our customs. This false accusation set the stage for misguided thoughts and actions from the crowds that would make it difficult for Paul to witness to many of these Jews at Jerusalem and to share the good news of what God was doing among the Gentiles. News of Paul's presence in the city eventually erupted into a riot spun by those Orthodox Jews that threatened to take the life of this apostle. Paul's life had been spared by a Roman commander who referred him to the high council to get to the bottom of this public disturbance. Although Paul had been rescued from a mob out for his blood, he was still in trouble with the Roman authorities, who wanted to know the reason behind the uproar that seemed to follow Paul wherever he went. The standard operating procedure for getting to the bottom of things was to question the troublemakers while flogging them. As they were prepping Paul for interrogation, he plays his get out of flogging free card by informing them that he is a Roman citizen. So the Roman authorities are forced to go to plan B. Perhaps they can get more information by bringing Paul before the Jewish authorities. Let's find out how this plays out as we listen to our scripture in this audio recording from the Common English Bible.
The commander was alarmed when he realized he had bound a Roman citizen. The commander still wanted to know the truth about why Paul was being accused by the Jews. Therefore, the next day, he ordered the chief priests and the entire Jerusalem council to assemble. Then he took Paul out of prison and had him stand before them. Paul stared at the council and said, "Brothers, I have lived my life with an altogether clear conscience right up to this very day." The high priest Ananias ordered those standing beside Paul to strike him in the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God is about to strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit and judge me according to the law, yet disobey the law by ordering that I be struck." Those standing near him asked, "You dare to insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I wasn't aware that he was the high priest. It is written, 'You will not speak evil about a ruler of your people.'" Knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, Paul exclaimed in the council, "Brothers, I'm a Pharisee and a descendant of Pharisees. I am on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead." These words aroused a dispute between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. This is because Sadducees say that there's no resurrection, angel, or spirit, but Pharisees affirm them all. Council members were shouting loudly. Some Pharisees who were legal experts stood up and insisted forcefully, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so heated that the commander feared they might tear Paul to pieces. He ordered soldiers to go down and remove him by force from their midst. Then they took him back to the military headquarters. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Be encouraged. Just as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so too you must testify in Rome."
Well, it appears the Roman authorities didn't get the answers they were hoping for. Once again, it was necessary for them to extract Paul from a life-threatening situation. For Paul, his appearance before the Jerusalem Council was an opportunity to share his consistent belief in the resurrection of Jesus with the ruling body of Judaism. It's very doubtful that Paul convinced them, but he did manage to reignite a long-standing debate. The Sadducees and the Pharisees both rejected Jesus as the prophesied Messiah. However, the Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection of the dead or that deceased persons could come back as angels or spirits. To them, dead was dead. Dead brought either complete end to life or a shadowy existence separate from God. Their focus was on strict adherence to the first 5 books of the Torah. The Pharisees, on the other hand, accepted the resurrection of the dead. They also believed in the angels and spirits. Their focus was on interpreting and enforcing Mosaic law. The council was hostile towards Paul. In fact, the high priest Ananias had Paul struck in the mouth. Paul cries foul because the high priest, who's supposed to uphold the law, was breaking the law by ordering Paul to be struck before he was convicted. In the heated exchange that followed, Paul says that he was not even aware that Ananias was the high priest. It's at this time that Paul decides to really poke the bear. He announces that he is a Pharisee from a long line of Pharisees and that he firmly believes in the resurrection of the dead, aligning him with the Pharisees on the council. Mayhem ensues, and Paul has to be removed for his personal safety. It's ironic to note that Paul never got the chance to say anything about Jesus, the resurrected Messiah. The differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees may seem inconsequential to us today, but differences in our faith have consequences for us, as we will learn from this Cokesbury video clip by Reverend Greg Weeks.
Do you know church buildings that no longer serve as churches? Congregations that met in them vanished. They're now vacant, demolished, or have been turned into museums, bed and breakfast, or restaurants and bars. What happened? The passage from Acts 23, where Paul is being questioned by some powerful religious leaders, gives us a cue. This took place in Jerusalem, where the apostle had caused quite a stir. He had told a crowd about Jesus. Now he, Paul, had been called to minister to the Gentiles. This enraged the more hardline Jews. So the Roman authorities wanted to see if he deserved punishment. They ordered him to stand trial before a religious council. This was a court presided over by the high priest and composed of Jewish leaders, elders, and legal experts. Paul was shrewd. He knew what to do. He threw gasoline on a smoldering fire. What's going on? I'm a Pharisee, and I believe in the resurrection of the dead. One part of the crowd was made up of this Jewish sect, and they went, "Hey, he's one of us. He couldn't have done anything wrong." Another faction was made up of Sadducees, a group that denied the resurrection. If he's one of them, then he's guilty. And a huge fight ensued, not over the apostle, but over a religious doctrine. It got so heated that later some of the leaders even plotted to kill Paul. As Paul took in this scene, you can imagine that he smirked a bit. And this is why modern folks have so often smirked at the church. They've seen it as an organization where people fight over questions that no one asks anymore. Should infants be baptized? Can non-members take communion? What color should we paint the fellowship hall? Such questions are countless as well as internally focused. People who ask them may think they're protecting tradition or the building. Ultimately, though, they're centered on preserving the institution instead of letting the institution serve Jesus. And that is why churches turn into cafes. Churches become relevant when they're more interested in addressing what's on people's minds and hearts. What is the purpose of my life? Can I have a second chance? Where can I find people I trust? How do I navigate the divisiveness all around me? How can I make a difference in the world? How can I help others? The answers lie with Jesus. Our mission as a church is to present the gospel in relevant, compelling ways. Paul did that in his preaching. John Wesley did too, after his heart was strangely warmed. His passion for Jesus broke him free from the institutional church, and he started a movement that went onto street corners and into people's homes. Maybe that's the key. If we're going to be relevant, we need to get back to the time in each of our lives when Jesus first became relevant to us. When did he walk out of the pages of Scripture and into your life? When did he invite you into a different way to live, where you found forgiveness, direction, and hope? When did you discover brothers and sisters who would walk beside you in both bright and dark times? I'm convinced that the future church will not close its doors and turn into a museum. It's not going to focus on irrelevant questions that divide and separate. Rather, the future church will be where authentic, life-changing, and life-affirming connections are made. It will be home to Christians whose hearts have been warmed by Jesus. We will be an inviting fellowship where people will feel comfortable sharing what they're going through, what their challenges and hopes are. And in the process, we will all discover and celebrate the Christ who is alive and whose compassion is contagious.
Reverend Bob Gardner selected verse 9 as the key verse for this lesson. Council members were shouting loudly. Some Pharisees, who are legal experts, stood up and insisted forcefully, "We find nothing wrong with this man. What if a spirit or an angel had spoken to him?" Now, while this is a key point in the scripture, I would have, however, chosen verse 11. The following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Be encouraged. Just as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so too you must also testify in Rome." Paul might have felt pretty good about how he provoked that argument between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But as night settled and Paul remained in Roman custody with his fate unknown, I'll bet he was feeling alone and vulnerable. And then Jesus appeared and told him to be encouraged. Wow! 1/3 of the Holy Trinity appearing right there in front of him. I'll bet that made Paul's day. Be encouraged. Jesus assured Paul that he would be able to carry the gospel message to Rome. Jesus' assurance confirmed to Paul that the trip to Rome was an integral part of God's own plan for Paul. Allow me to close with this observation. Jesus says to Paul, "Be encouraged." In the gospel, Jesus says, "Be encouraged" 6 times. He says it to sick people and to his disciples, people who, like Paul, needed a couple words of encouragement. If you read Paul's letters, you'll see that he must have taken these 2 words to heart. Be encouraged. He repeats these same words 5 times in his letters in the New Testament. How many times do we need to hear these words, these 2 simple words? Be encouraged. How often do others need to hear these same words? Be encouraged. End of observation and end of lesson. The scripture for next week comes from Acts 28, verses 1 through 10. In this lesson, we will examine the importance of extending hospitality towards others. As always, stay safe and see you next week.